Aric Chen. I'm the Curatorial Director for Design Miami. And on behalf of Design Miami, we are really privileged to have this Q&A today with John and Mira Nakashima. Now, this talk is, of course, tied to the world premiere of the documentary George Nakashima Woodworker, produced by John, who we'll hear from in a second, along with Mira and many others. Um, Design Miami has been very honored to host that world premiere, which began Friday night Eastern Standard Time in the US. I assume many of you have had the chance to see the film. If you haven't, it will be still up on the Design Miami website for another 13 hours or so till midnight Eastern Standard Time. And after that, you'll be able to go to the website nakashimadocumentary.com to sign up for access to the film in the future. So without further ado, I'm going to welcome our guests tonight, or today, depending where you are. I'd like to welcome John Nakashima, who is the producer of the film. He's a television producer in West Virginia, working for West Virginia Public Broadcasting. This film, of course, was a labor of love. Among other things, John is also the nephew of George Nakashima, the subject. And joining him and us today is also Mira Nakashima, George's daughter, who, with her brother Kevin, has been really carrying the torch at the Nakashima Studios in New Hope, Pennsylvania, where she is now since her father's death in 1990, though Mira really grew up in the studio and began working there as early as 1970. She's a designer in her own right, but also, along with John, probably the world's foremost experts on George Nakashima. And we are going to talk a little bit about Nakashima's life and his work. And we thought, and also to answer questions from you. So if you have any questions, please do feel free throughout this session to send them through the Q&A function on your screen, and we'll be sure to ask them. Again, you've all probably seen the film, but just in case you haven't, we thought we would just play a short trailer, which we will do now, and then we'll come back in about 3 minutes and begin the discussion then.
It sure is silent.
I don't think there's any sound.
Well, there is the cross-deck table.
We got the best narrator here. Maybe Lauren, is it because is it because you're muted? All right. Well, we are.
Well, we're back.
Hopefully, we'll sort that out. Lauren, give us a thumbs up in the chat if when we're ready to try to show that again. But John, I mean, this is. I mentioned this was a real labor of love for you. I mean, you've been working on this film for 20 years now. Maybe
on and off, yeah.
Yeah. I mean, George Nakashima passed away in 1990 after leading an incredible life, as you so vividly portrayed in the documentary. What sort of prompted you to begin working on this film?
Well, it was a realization, I guess, that a lot of major artists have like one film. I just discovered this over watching films about artists, that there's one major film made about them. And, you know, that's the one chance they get. And I noticed, I had figured that the definitive documentary had already been made about George and I had just missed it. But I mean, the most major production he was in, probably when he was alive, was the, well, there were two. There was one on aging and creativity called Seasons of Life. And there was another one that was a National Geographic Explorer special. And that was like in the 80, I think 83 or something. And that was like 15 minutes long, I believe. I couldn't get any of their footage. They only reserved their footage for National Geographic products. So they had probably the best footage. And I suppose their NHK did in Japan, public broadcasting in Japan, did shows on him because he had many shows in his latter years in Japan that were very popular. So yeah, I realized here it was 10 years after his death, or I was thinking about it all the time since he died. And then I started collecting, what interviews had survived, what could be found. And there was the interview that's in profile that you'll see in the documentary, or that you've seen in the documentary. And that was for the Seasons of Life documentary. And then he was interviewed for like 2 local cable shows. But the good thing about the cable shows and the good thing about the Seasons of Life is they just let George go, and which was his normal mode of operation when you were just talking to him, and he would tell very extensive stories. And so that, I mean, they weren't particularly great quality, but we fixed them up by post-production people helped me fix them up. And there was also an interview with Studs Terkel, and there was an early interview with Terry Gross. There was an oral history that was written, but the recording had been lost, and that would have been a real treasure. And I think that's about it.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Now, Mira, you were working with your father. Well, once again, you really grew up, in your
Grew up on
father's
the
home.
workbench, yeah.
Grew up on a workbench, exactly. But you began sort of working, more or less full time at the studio in 1970. I mean,
Yeah.
throughout this long period, was there, was there a sense that a sort of archive net needed to be maintained? Because John, you had such great materials that you seem to have unearthed. I'm wondering, the extent to which the studio itself kept these sort of materials.
Well, my mother kept records of everything, and the order information, for instance, she insisted on condensing into 3x5 cards, so there wasn't a whole lot of information about any of the orders, but they were all filed carefully in alphabetical order with the amount of money that they paid, and a number of items which they may have ordered. So when John Terry came along and said that he wanted to do this film, I was also curious. My father had passed, and I was curious as to why he did what he did. And thank goodness John Terry knew how to do archival research, and it was all new territory for us. I mean, Terry would come and stay. I'm sorry. Growing up, the producer's name was Terry, and so I always call him Terry. His grown-up name now is John, and I call him John Terry when I remember, and when I don't remember, he's Terry. So sorry, it's the same person. But he would come and stay with us, and he would rummage around in the closets, and he'd find packets of old letters and old photographs and awards and stuff that we didn't even know was there.
His suitcases
Full of stuff. And he would
stickers from around the world.
Yeah, and he says, "Did you know this happened? Did you know this happened?" I said, "No." So he started organizing the letters that he found archivally, or at least alphabetically and chronologically, so we could make sense of them. And that was, I was researching for my book, and at the same time he was researching for his film. So he helped me a lot on learning how to do research and finding stuff in strange places. So we're now continuing the archival work, and hopefully if anybody else does research for a film or book or something, that'll be a little better organized. In the meantime, I've also given some of the documentation to the Michener Museum. I've given some of it to the University of Pennsylvania, mostly the the architectural archives, and it has mostly to do with the architectural history of Nakashima. And my mother, apparently, when my father died, gave a bunch of letters to the, what is it, in Washington, D.C.?
Smithsonian.
Smithsonian. So there is a pile of information there too, which I haven't really explored yet. But there's still, even with all the research we've done, I'm sure there's still unexplored territory, and there will always be discoveries in Nakashima history, or questions, mysteries in Nakashima history that we'll never solve. But this is a great step forward.
Yeah, well, I mean, he lived quite a life. I mean, maybe we can show some of our first images, and you could talk about a little bit about the family, because there's a great story there.
George was, oh yeah, sorry to interrupt.
No, please go ahead.
Well, I was going to say that when he was young, he would shoo everyone out of the kitchen and black out the windows and turn the kitchen into a dark room. So he was a photographer. His father, Katsuharu, was a photographer, and he won a first place award. Japanese really enjoy photography. And then when he was on his world tour, when he was in France, he hung out with Walker Evans. And then throughout his whole life, he always seemed to have the best photographers, incredible people like Ezra Stoller, taking extensive photographs for him. And the great thing about George and Marion is they never threw out anything. And so that, yeah, it's quite a photographic record.
Yeah, well, I mean, I always think of him as being of that great generation of what used to be called internationalists, which included Buckminster Fuller and Isamu Noguchi. And in fact, you have a great photograph in the film of Nakashima with Noguchi and Fuller. But for Nakashima himself, I mean, he was, of course, one of the great American 20th century designers and master craftsmen, or woodworkers, as he preferred to be called. But part of that was derived from the very strong imprint of his family's roots in Japan. We see here some photo of his great grandfather, who was one of Japan's last samurais. Is that right?
It was only his grandfather.
Excuse me. Yes.
So George was not that far away from the samurai generation.
Yeah, and then and we see him on the right with his grandmother. Is that right? Who
on his mother's side, yeah.
On his mother's side, on his mother's side, there was a tradition of membership at the imperial court. Is that right? Like they were ladies in waiting. Yeah,
not a tradition. She was the only one. Our grandmother was the only one in the family, as far as we know, who served in the imperial court. A friend of hers invited her and said, "You ought to come work in the imperial court. It's great." But way back when, it's said that the Nakashimas are from Tottori, which is the place where Women in the Dunes was shot. And it's this great Japanese dune that's visited by a lot of Japanese, and it's on the Japan seaside. Right. And that's where the samurais, I believe, lived. And this man probably lived in Tokyo because, the daimyos all had to come to Tokyo, or Edo at the time, to serve. And so he was born in Tokyo.
Okay, but
can I just speak to that, the image on the left that says George Nakashima, woodworker? We continue to have very strong ties to Japan to this day. From 1964 on, Dad has been affiliated with the Mingei group in Takamatsu, Japan, and he did maybe a dozen shows in Tokyo because of these people who manufactured his designs. in Japan, and the plaque on the left is one of the plaques that they created on my father's brush writing. They carved it for one of the shows, and we had that in our showroom. And I'm sorry, John Terry was looking for a logo, and I said, oh, you got to use that carved logo that we have in the workshop, because it's so distinctive. It's made on black walnut, and it was carved in Japan by Dad's associates there, and it has very significant meanings because of our affiliation with Japan to this day.
Great. Now, I mean, I think a lot of people are aware, at least vaguely, about Nakashima's connection to Japan, and how Japanese traditions and craftsmanship and worldviews and philosophies, Shinto and so on and so forth, may have informed his work. But I think what is less known, perhaps, is the influence his time in India had. And maybe we can go to the next slide. Those who've seen the documentary will know that Nakashima, having grown up in Seattle and taken a very circuitous path via MIT, a scholarship at Fontainebleau in France, sort of exposure to Chartres and the sort of notion of the communal, the Gothic cathedrals as emerging from a sense of communal effort and so on. He went to then Japan for a while. There he met Antonin Raymond, who was there working for Frank Lloyd Wright on the Imperial Hotel in Tokyo. And I think nowadays we think of ourselves as being this incredibly, or up until recently, as being this incredibly global world, but we forget that ideas and people and things have always been circulating. And of course, Frank Lloyd Wright was in Tokyo in the 20s. Raymond was there working on the Imperial Hotel there for Wright. And through Raymond, Nakashima wound up in Pondicherry, India. Maybe John, Mira, you can tell us a little bit more about that as a really seminal moment in his life and thinking.
Do you want to do it, Mira?
Oh, go ahead. It's all in your film.
Well, yeah. I mean, he was the one who took the big risk, and we're sitting around the draft room and at Antonin Raymond's, and Raymond says, "Who wants to go to India? That is like a 3-day arduous trip away and build a building for an ashram." And George raised his hand and said, me, and he went. He was, as it says in the film, he went by Japan, and he would hear the bombing of China by Japan, and then he went to this French enclave of there were certain areas in India that were French, and Pondicherry was the capital. And Sri Aurobindo, who was an early, he was the first, they say, who
he was a guru. He was a teacher. Dad said he was one of the greatest philosophers of the 20th century. And didn't it took, you said it was a 3-day trip. It was more like a 2-week trip, wasn't it? By ship from India?
Maybe.
It was a long time, but Dad was up for the adventure, and it became a great adventure for him, not only in the way of construction, because it was the first reinforced concrete building built in India, let alone Far East, I think. And so that was a physical adventure, but he became a disciple of Sri Aurobindo in 1938 because he was so taken with the philosophy and the community and the way of being and the teachers, Sri Aurobindo himself and his partner Mira Alfasa. So he became a disciple of Sri Aurobindo till the rest of his life. It was a turning point. It was a great revelation in his life. He thought he was going to stay there for forever until the war broke out. So Yeah.
We should probably mention that the project in Pondicherry that he was there working on was Golconde, which was like a dormitory where
Right.
followers of Aurobindo would live. And John, in the film, you draw this beautiful analogy between Golconde and Chartres, in that Golconde was also meant to be a
Mhm.
building built by the community members. Although I guess that became a source of friction at one point. Um, but you know, your Nakashima took on a Sanskrit name even. I'm not going to try to. I'm not going to mangle it. I'm going to ask you to instead remind
Sundarananda.
us.
Sundarananda, which they explain as being bliss and beauty. So it says, I mean, it says you can either be blissful because of beauty or because you're creating beauty. Yeah, it's Sanskrit, and it was the
Yeah.
name that was put on his grave.
And in fact, Mira, you're named after the mother of that community, who
Yeah.
was also yes, yeah. I mean that it's incredible how profound that period was on him. Just as an aside, it just makes me think of how we often overlook these influences coming from elsewhere when we think about design in the U.S. or even Europe. I mean, it's just been in recent years that real attention has been placed on Ettore Sozza's his time in India in the 1960s, which had a profound impact on him and sort of informed his work later on with Memphis and postmodernism. But going back to Nakashima, I mean, you know, this time in India was in some ways, you know, a culmination, according to the film, John, if I'm not mistaken, you know, of a young man who was very much, you know, in search of himself, as they say, and it came on the heels of his period in Japan, which was also a bit of a awakening or reawakening for him, if that's fair to say. Did he ever draw parallels between, you know, on a sort of philosophical, spiritual, or even esoteric level? How did he draw parallels between, you know, what his experiences with Japan and those with India?
Well, I mean, he did it in his autobiography, and which is called Soul of a Tree, and but he did it very quickly. And those chapters are very short. And like I said before, if you were to ask him to tell you the story, or you wouldn't even have to ask him, but he would tell you the story of India, and it would be a lengthy story with a lot of incredibly vivid detail. Um, and those were the stories that I wanted to really flesh out in the documentary. And that's when I discovered that there was no experts on that period. And there were no witnesses. I interviewed Mary, his sister, and Marion, his wife, and I found that they were quoting from Soul of a Tree. And so, yeah, I had to discover. I did a lot of research, and then I do 2 plus 2. This has to equal 4. This has to equal 4. So you know, I took some risks, but every risk I took, I tried to measure carefully. And I was the one who saw the connections.
Right.
Because George always said he was a druid, and I'm the one naysayer who says he stopped in England to get his teeth fixed, but I don't think he became a druid.
Oh, but he called himself a Japanese druid.
Well, there is that. Yeah. But my figuring is that he was really saying I was influenced by Shintoism, which at the time it was like post-war, and that meant that Shintoism was not a good word in those days, and that because the other side of Shintoism was the emperor was God. So maybe not the most popular terminology to use. So
Sure. Well, on that note, maybe let's skip to the next slide, or let's go to the next slide, where we see George in New Hope, where he and the family settles in the 1940s. Now, what we've jumped over here. Oh, sorry, we'll get there in a second. But what we've jumped over here is the time that George and his family, your family, including you, Mira, as a baby, spent in the U.S. government's Japanese internment camps during World War II in Idaho, in your case, though the family was, I believe, sort of scattered among a couple of internment camps. Oh, sorry, let's go to the slide before that, Lauren. I think we're missing one where we have George in the studio. Is that right? Well, anyway, so that, of course, was a dark chapter in American history. You really described just really how awful the conditions were, and how what a horrible thing that was, and it was in fact Anton and Raymond who helped get George and his immediate family out of the internment camp to
no, it was Noemi Raymond.
Amy Raymond, excuse me, his wife, who helped get the family to New Hope, ostensibly as employees of the Raymond farm. We have a couple of questions from the audience that relate to this. One is about Marion. Someone wants to know about Marion's life with George from navigating life in the internment through setting up setting up the home in New Hope. She comes across as such a strong woman, and I wonder what kind of role she played in these key moments.
Oh, you want me to answer that, Terry?
Yes.
You can answer it from your perspective. But my parents were both brought up in Seattle, and apparently they didn't know each other until they bumped into each other in Tokyo in 1940. And I guess they thought that was kind of fate because they did have the same background. They were both born of Japanese immigrants in the Seattle community, so they had that in common. You kind of picked up the fact that my mother was tough. I think my father asked her to marry him because he realized that if he started his own business, he wasn't very much of a businessman. He would need a business partner. And she was his business partner throughout the whole thing. In his book, The Soul of a Tree, he says, I thank Marion for standing by me, even if she couldn't quite figure out what I was doing. She did manage the books, and she made sure the bills were paid and the furniture went out on time. And bless her heart, she didn't really appreciate what he was doing until after he passed. And all this, there were thousands of letters of condolence that came in when my father died, and my mother would look at them and think, this is my husband. She kind of didn't appreciate him, but I think after he was gone, she started to appreciate him a bit more.
But she did definitely have the business sense that George didn't have.
Yeah, that was a good combination, because if Dad had been left to manage his finances by himself, we wouldn't have gotten anywhere.
There is I should mention, there's a move afoot in the Japanese American community to not call the places internment camps, because that's a euphemism. And they were actually, I called them family incarceration camps, but some people call them concentration camps. But trying to move away from that terminology.
But I think Uncle Ted called it concentration camps, didn't he? And my father did also. I mean, that's really what they were. I mean, they weren't as bad as the ones in Europe, but they were armed guards, and who would shoot you if you got too close to the fence.
You could see the size of Tule Lake in the
Yep.
documentary. My
Huge.
God, it was huge. It was
Yeah.
vast.
Yep.
And it was on this just dry plain.
Forsaken desert. Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, Minidoka was bad enough.
Mhm.
Yeah.
Well, I asked you this question before, Mira, but maybe I'll ask it again, because having brought up Noguchi already, of course, he spent time in those concentration camps as well, and I wonder if your father and he ever spoke about that.
I don't know if they ever really spoke about it, but it was because of Knoll that dad met Isamu Noguchi and Harry Bertoia. And I think that may be part of the reason that he decided to go with Knoll, because he liked the guys that were working with him. But Noguchi was, I think it was in New York when the war happened, so he was not incarcerated. He volunteered to go into camp to teach the internees how to do art. And then he was discriminated against by both the military and the internees themselves, because he had a separate place that was nicer to live than the rest of us did. And they decided he was Japanese American. They wouldn't let him go. I mean, it's just bizarre. I mean, this whole racial discrimination thing, and he was confused anyway, because in a way, because his mother was Irish American and his father was Japanese, and his father left him, I guess, when he was a young kid, and went back to Japan and had a different Japanese family. And he had sort of an identity problem anyway, but I think he identified culturally much more with Europe and Brancusi and the American design milieu than he did with Japan.
Right.
Whereas my father related, I think, more strongly to the Japanese designers
Sure.
and architects.
Now, that last question was from Julian Howard, and we have a question now from Jeremy Hunter. As we said, Nakashima and his immediate family were able to leave the concentration camp in Idaho at the invitation of Noemi. Raymond and Jeremy Hunter wants to know more about the relationship between Antonin, Raymond, and George in the war years after he and Noemi got Nakashima out of the camps. Did that relationship not end well? And I'm not sure what Jeremy's referring to specifically, but maybe you do.
Well, it was later. Go ahead, Mira.
No, I don't know. I learned a lot of things, especially on the chronology of that from the film. I was never sure quite when we left Minidoka, or quite when we got to Raymond Farm, or when we went out on our own into that little house on Ekatong. And I guess you got some kind of documentation, so you figured out the dates. Thank you, Terry.
Yeah.
So what did you start to say? Go ahead.
Well, there was much later. I mean, they had a good relationship. They were all living in this big house together, right? Antonin and Raymond and these young architects and George and his family. And I think Mira, I think they were living on the third floor, and Mira was like a little girl, and she nearly went walking out open third-story window. Is that what happened?
Yeah, I didn't really walk out, but I pushed the screen door out, or screen window out, and was sitting on the step, which opened on the window. And my mother was terrified. She thought I was going to fall out the window, but I didn't. So
yeah, but much later, after they were all established, I didn't get into this. Antonin and Raymond kind of took offense at George's claim of authorship of Golconda, and it was kind of
also Karuizawa in Japan.
Yeah,
I had grown up thinking Karuizawa was my father's church, and that Golconda was my father's building. And Raymond, well, he was working for Raymond at the time, so Raymond said they were his, they weren't George's. So yeah, that did not sit well, I don't think.
No, and I think. Did you send it to me? There was this huge ream of papers where Raymond was arguing his case with who was that other architect? Yoshimura?
Yes.
And Yoshimura was on Raymond's side. And
Oh,
yeah, and
I didn't know that.
yeah, it was, I mean, if it was a 4-hour documentary, I would have got into it. But actually, if it was a 4-hour documentary, I would have got more into its architecture.
Well, I think it could go 4 or 5 or 6, depending on your points of view. I mean, it was really frustrating for me because John Terry has produced so many little segments, all with slightly different points of view and slightly different footage. And I was just disappointed to see that you had to cut so much of it, but it was extremely well cut and well stitched together. And it was great. It's just, I missed all the stuff that wasn't there.
Yeah.
I
And
think we need to keep going.
and there were people who were advising me, experts on cinema storytelling, who were telling me, you got to cut way more.
Yeah.
So they really wanted me to get it down to an hour.
Yeah. Oh
But
God.
I couldn't do it. I couldn't do it.
Yeah. No, it's tough. You have so much material, and like
Yep.
really tough.
Such an interesting life.
Mm-hmm.
Well, John, I think we're all going to be looking forward to the boxed set one day.
Well, the DVD's going to have extras, and you're
Sure.
going to find some great stories on the extras.
Great, great. Now, I think, Mira, you had sort of briefly brought up Knoll and I think Bertoia, and there are a couple of questions about that. One came in previous to this discussion from from Jeffrey Shaper, who is a former House Beautiful magazine editor, who's basically, and I'm just going to paraphrase his question now, basically asking what the relationship between Nakashima and Knoll was, how they came to meet. He thinks it's interesting that that Nakashima was undoubtedly the first major studio wood artist craftsman to design for Knoll, at the same time that Bertoia was making his metal furniture for that same company. So, can you tell us a little bit more about the relationship between Knoll and Nakashima, and maybe Bertoia, and how they came to join forces, and also what was Nakashima's attitude towards and aspirations for production furniture, and how might that have influenced his other work afterwards?
This is murky territory on which I don't have any information. I don't know if John Terry came across any. The only things that I remember distinctly is that we did a show at the Michener Museum on Nakashima and the modernist moment in Europe. And at that point, Matilda McQuaid was the head curator at MoMA, and she opened up this box of documents between Rene Donnercourt, my father, and I think there's one letter there that said he really, he met Knoll. There was a picture in the film of Knoll, Hans Knoll, and Belusky's daughter, Helen, and me at the Raymond Farm. And so we must have met Knoll when we were at Raymond Farm. And they were trying to develop this cadre of designers in the 1940s. And my father wrote to Rene Donnercourt, and he said he didn't think it was a good idea at all. And then somehow or other, he was convinced that it was okay to do. And then he did some of the production in his own studio and shipped it off to the Knoll showroom in New York. And eventually they decided to do the production all in East Greenville. And in the process, he met Harry Bertoia, and I think they must have commiserated a lot because they were both hands-on designer makers. And they weren't just paper designers, they were actually hands-on makers. And so I think Harry and Dad became very good friends at that time. He also met Isamu Noguchi, who was a little bit the same way. He did a lot of, I mean, in the sense that he understood the Japanese aesthetic, and he wanted to develop and retain the handcraft traditions in Japan by adapting them to modern usage, which is exactly what Dad's group, the Mingei, was doing in the 1970s or 1960s. So So they became friends and they worked alongside each other. And Dad was never really happy. I mean, he started his furniture business as a protest to mass production. He did not think that mass production was the answer to the world. He thought that it should retain the human contact with the materials and with tools and with, maintaining direct contact with the clients as well. He just didn't like the way that modernism was going. I think you have an interview of him that comes out in the film saying so, Terry. I think that there was something about that he didn't like, the way modernism and modern architecture were going, because it dehumanized everybody.
Oh,
So,
of course, yeah. In Paris, when he saw death.
yeah. But on the other hand, it helped him along. I mean, it got his name out a lot further than it would have. I mean, his second venture with mass production was with Whittaker Mueller. And that was quite short-lived because they would take his designs and change them as they wished. And he had no control over what was happening. And he didn't like that at all. And he eventually quit. But it got his name out there. I mean, there are a lot of people, who buy the Whittaker production on secondary markets still. It's still pretty good stuff.
Yeah. As I was growing up, we had a early plank table, and I've told Mira this before, and it was super hard. And when I was a little kid, I would like get underneath it and then get up suddenly and like bump my head really hard on that thing. And but on top of the coffee table was all the latest clippings from or all the latest magazines that George was in. And there was so many of them, Look, Life, Fortune, eventually National Geographic, Smithsonian.
Your parents kept them all on that table?
Yeah, and like,
Wow.
my father was a doctor, and other doctors would show up and they'd want to see the latest. And yeah, we had the complete collection. And they were all pretty worn out too from a lot of viewings. Yeah.
Great. Just to dive a little bit deeper into the relationship between Nakashima and Bertoia, Arthur Fink says that he was during one of his visits to your studio that his father saw a Bertoia piece of Nakashima's and decided to commission a sculpture by Bertoia that was to hang over Nakashima's double cabinet. So apparently Arthur's father had commissioned works by both. And Arthur says he knows that the two of them shared their designs with each other and believes that this sharing may have affected both of their work. What do you think of that, Mira?
Oh, that's an interesting story. I didn't know that story.
Yeah.
I know that Harry and Dad, as I said, were good friends because they were both designer makers. They weren't just designers for Knoll. And I don't believe they actually shared any, they didn't collaborate on anything, but I do know that they were good enough friends that when the Conoid studio was built in 1960, Harry gave Dad a couple of sculptures for that building because he thought it was a beautiful building and wanted to gift him something. And so Dad gave him some furniture in exchange. So they were good friends. And then I think when he finished the Arts building in 1967, Harry also gave my father a different form sculpture. And again, my father gave him Nakashima furniture in return. Val Bertoia says that Dad gave Harry a stool. I think it was a chair without a back on it to work from. So he says I think that's still in the Bertoia studio, that full of all kinds of dings and drippings and so forth, because he used it in his studio. So they were good friends. They just exchanged stuff. I don't think they exchanged design ideas particularly.
Okay.
We exchanged a lot of food. We used to go visit them, and they used to visit us, and their kids became my friends. They still are.
Okay, great. Well, Arthur just came back saying he has letters he believes from both Nakashima and Bertoia referring to their having met and seen sketches of each other's designs in early form, which is not so different from what you're saying, Mira, but it's always more complicated to ascertain influence.
If you want to share them, please
Yeah.
send us copies, and they will end up in some archive eventually. So
That's
we're trying to
interesting.
get everything together.
Yeah, and Arthur, I think you'll be able to reach John, like everyone else, through the nakashimadocumentary.com site, which we'll talk about at the end of today's session. Let's go to the next slide, which shows the sort of early, the early sort of studio or home. I'm sorry, in New Hope, with a detail of one of George's first kind of woodworking pieces, this trestle table. Now, we got a question from, from Gordon, and I'm sorry if I'm mispronouncing it, Gordon Korstange or Korstan, who says that who wants to know more about the influence of shaker furniture on George's.
That is obviously a trestle table, which is inspired by the Shakers. Dad was very much inspired by the Shaker way of life, as their way of being and their way of making things that was simple, that was unadorned, and honest. And the slide on the right is a picture of the joint at the bottom of the trestle table that my father made. It's completely disassemblable. This is a joint that comes apart. And I think it's not particularly a shaker joint, but I think it might have been adapted from Japanese joinery. And he developed this design. I think it was one of his very first dining table designs in the 1940s. We still make it exactly the same way today. Dad felt that if you had a good design, it was, you didn't have to change it just because it was a different year or a different trend, but it was a good design forever. So we hope that's true. We're still making them that way.
Yeah. I mean, the simplicity of the Shakers was so similar to the simplicity of Zen, don't you think, Mira?
Yep.
Yeah.
Which leads us to our next question from John Ware.
I wanted to say one more thing.
Yes, please.
There's this incredible photo that I kept wanting to use where it's of the showroom and there's a bunch of grass-seated chairs and they're hanging on pegs just like you would at a Shaker house.
Yep.
I just always wanted to get that in there because it was so Shaker looking.
Great. Now, John Ware, on the other hand, wants to know more about his connections to the Mingei movement in Japan and the leaders of that movement.
Well, Dad was in Japan when Soetsu Yanagi started the Mingei movement. I don't know if Dad was particularly involved in that movement per se back in the 1930s when he was with Raymond. I think they were very influential on the Raymonds themselves, though. So he might have had contact. I don't have any documentation on that. When Dad went back to Japan in 1964, he hooked up with this group that was called, it was through Masayuki Nagare, who was a sculptor, and he had been exhibiting in New York, and he designed this big wall of volcanic rock that they brought all the way from Japan for the 1964 World's Fair. It was called Stone Crazy. And that's when my father first met him. He brought his stonemasons to visit the shop. And then Dad said, well, I guess he invited my father to visit him at his shop in Shikoku. And eventually he did. And he was so enamored with this group of artisans who were attempting to keep alive the old Japanese craft traditions, but adapt them to modern design so they wouldn't die. That he joined the group in 1964, and it was an offshoot of the Mingei movement. The Mingei movement was primarily just to preserve the older things that had been made in Japan and Korea, and to realize the aesthetics of those older things instead of throwing them out like they did with, they would have been wont to do in the 20th century. Especially during wartime. So he wanted to create a reason to collect the older pieces. And in 1964, he discovered the Minguren group, who were actually adapting the old craft traditions to modern design. And he became one of their group. And as far as I know, we still are. That's our main connection to Japan at this point.
Mira, I read somewhere that you and John at some point in the I think at some point in the early 2000s maybe interviewed Sori Yanagi, who of course was Soetsu's son. Did
Yes.
anything come out of that that might?
You talked a lot about garbage.
He did talk about garbage, but that was a precious interview. Yeah, he bemoaned the fact that modern day societies make too much garbage. Yeah, he did talk about garbage. Wasn't quite the interview I was expecting, but we were very fortunate to meet him when we did.
Okay.
Yeah, I was going to talk a little bit about Mingei. George, in later life, he really advocated Yanagi's book, right?
Yes.
Yeah, and they to this day you sell them in the gift shop.
We do. Yeah.
What's that book's called? Oh, The Unknown Craftsman.
Right.
Yeah, and George really admired Yanagi, definitely, and he was definitely at the time that Yanagi was doing his thing. George was there. The only difference, I think, in my humble opinion, is that Mingei was about very quickly done bowls and very quickly done objects. One of the most famous being, a tea bowl, and George ended up making furniture that was anything but quick. I think it very carefully done. So I think that's the one difference between Mingei and George's work. But also, I think the irregularities that are so admired in Mingei are something that George really picked up on, and that's what drove him to using imperfect lumber. It was also something that Zen encouraged too, part of the Zen aesthetics. So he got that from two sources. I'm sure they were related.
Very much so. Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Yeah. No, I think the what you're talking about is, and T-bowls is primarily not of a conceptual difference, but of the material itself. Toshiko Takeuzu is also, she refused to say that had anything to do with Mingei, but I heard an interview of hers once, and that she was almost saying exactly the same thing, that you have to let the material tell you what to do with it and go with the flow. And that's exactly what Toshiko did, and that's what my father did, and that's what the Mingei artist did too. The difference between the original Mingei and my father now is that the original Mingei objects were created, as you say, quickly for common people to use, and were affordable, and it's no longer possible. So Sori Yanagi did say something. He said the closest he got to being Mingei is that he makes the models for his manufactured items by hand. And that was his contribution to the Mingei tradition, that he has to make the models by hand, but they are actually mass produced afterwards. And he says that's the only way to preserve that tradition of accessibility, which was also part of the original Mingei. But Dad didn't realize that, I don't think he read Yanagi really very carefully until the 80s. Yeah. I didn't read that book until we went to Japan, and I was sitting on the airplane for a long time. So I got to read it finally. And that was the jumping off point for me writing my book, because it was Bernard Leach just was able to translate all those concepts and into Western terms so we could understand it.
Yeah, and there was who was a German Bauhaus person who introduced everyone to Katsura.
What was his name?
The Japanese photographer.
Bernard.
Who?
Tout. Bernard Tout?
No, but there was also a Japanese photographer who took these iconic black and white images of Katsura. I want to say Ishimoto. I think he did it for a publication that I think Herbert Bayer designed. I'm probably get if someone in the audience knows, please. Bruno Tout.
Bruno Tout. Sorry.
Yes, of course.
Yeah. Yeah, I don't
Apparently
remember,
met, you know.
but was very, very influential and very important in the 50s. It was the post-war sort of rediscovery of Japan that brought that to the US, I believe.
Yeah, and also to Japanese, strangely enough. I mean, it's kind of sad, but that it would take a German to point out to Japanese, you got something really good going here, you know.
Whatever works.
We're starting to run a little bit short on time, but and there are a couple of other questions about Nakashima's relationship with Ben Shan, and also about his time in New Mexico at the Monastery of Christ. But I think maybe if you have something short to say about that, Mira or John, otherwise I think we should probably get in closer to the present, because there are a lot of great questions about the way that the workshop works nowadays, and the collaboration between George and the other craftsmen and you yourself, Mira, that I think we should get to. Is there anything about Ben Shan or New Mexico that?
Oh, Ben Shan was one of my dad's most favorite friends. Ben came to a show that my father had in New Hope in 1964, I believe it was, and bought one of the tables that was in the show. And there was a whole series of shots that Bob Hunziker did. He did Bernarda really spoke well in Terry's film, but there was an episode where Ben and Bernarda bought this table, and George says, well, we can ship it to you next week. And they said, oh, no, we want to take it home now. And it was in the middle of winter. They had a convertible car. So they put the top of the car down. Dad gave them 2 shots of whiskey and loaned his German wool hat from the internment camp to Bernarda, and sent them home with this table perched in the back of their convertible car. And they said that table was cold for 3 weeks, not to mention themselves. But they were really good friends. They were another group of artists that my father and mother associated with, and that I became friends of, the children of. We spent a lot of time together growing up. So and of course Dad built his building, the arts building, which was once called, it was built for a studio for Ben Shan, because he admired him and thought that he should have his own studio.
Great. So yeah, let's sort of.
Sorry, you'd asked about Christ in the Desert too. Yeah, that is a sort of a part of a long story. My father started doing work for Portsmouth Priory, which is a monastery, a monastic community has a school in Rhode Island. Became friends with Father Aelred, who was teaching there. Father Aelred went to Elmira to a community there, and Dad did the furniture at that chapel. And then Father Aelred decided to go out on his own. He went to a more remote location. Like he wanted to have a series of hermitages, and he asked my father to design the building, and he did it with indigenous materials, which was, he believed that one should use indigenous materials whenever possible, rather than importing all kinds of foreign stuff. So they made it from adobe, from the riverbank itself. They used stone that was from the canyon, built this beautiful chapel, which unfortunately didn't make it into the film, but Thomas Burton said he thought it was the most beautiful monastic chapel available in the world. So, there's another series of architecture you need to do, Terry.
I believe there was a reality show about that monastery.
There was?
Yeah.
Really?
Well, I could be wrong. I
don't know.
There are quite a number of questions again about the relationship between George, the other craftsman in the studio, and you, Mira. John, in your film, there is this moment where you talk about how George had had begun to sort of or the notion that, well, I mean, he insisted on becoming a woodworker, on being called a woodworker, partly because he wanted to get rid of this notion of ego, right? And maybe this is sort of drawn from the notion of Mingei as well, because the idea of anonymity was very important to Mingei. But at one point he realizes, or he decides that the work does not necessarily have to be in his own hand per se. And that's when the many other sort of craftsmen who work in the studio come in. Can you speak a little bit more about how he rationalized this sort of collaboration and the notion of authorship, and Mira, this comes into the present, or at least the period since 1990, during which the studio continues to produce George Nakashima furniture, even though he's not around. But maybe you can describe for us a little bit how that works. The idea that the idea that the legacy sort of goes beyond, the hand of the quote unquote author himself.
Yeah, I think from the very beginning. Oh, go ahead, Terry. Do you want to answer first?
You go.
In the very beginning, of course, Dad did all the work with his own two hands. But even when we were at the little house on Apatong before we moved to the present site, he had one person who helped him. Then when he came to the present site, I think he had two people, and then it slowly grew. And I think there were 12 of us altogether, including the office people, when he passed away in 1990. And during that period of time, he was until almost till the day he died, he was in the workshop every single day. And he didn't have, when I came in 1970, there were really, really sketchy drawings that he would give to each workman, and he would tell them, all day long what to do next. It wasn't drawn out in a drawing so that they could carry it from beginning to end. He had to be there to tell them what to do. And then when I came in 1970, I said, well, I think you should have more details on the drawing. I had studied architecture, and I thought, well, this is, really, it was a very artistic sketch, but I don't know how you can actually make something from it unless you're there all the time. So he would tell these men what to do. And sometimes I get stuck on a detail, and I said, well, how do you do this, Dad? And he says, oh, the guys know how to do it. So, I mean, there was always a dependence on those extra hands the whole time. And then when he passed away, the priest at my father's funeral in New Hope says, these hands can no longer make furniture. There will be no more furniture coming from Nakashima's studio. And I thought, wait a minute, the rest of us are still here. We can do this. So we've been doing it. And we have one man who was with us from 1970 as well. And he's been with us for 50 years, and he's retiring. I'm not retiring yet, but we're trying to create. I have a manager who's been with us for 13 years, and he has very consciously hired younger and younger people so that we have tiers of groups who are learning the techniques and the standards and the wood pile for all those years. And each of them, the longer they are here, the longer they have accumulated knowledge, and hopefully that will be passed on to future generations. And we're grateful to have people here as competent as they are and as collaborative as we are. We also have two assistant designers right now who have taken over a lot of my duties in the design department. We do a lot of work online now and through photography rather than people coming in person, partially because of COVID, but we're able to keep going through the internet. And
John, thank you, Mira. John, you wanted to say something, I think.
I think Adam, who was a German woodworker that was in the film briefly, he appreciated it, George's guidance more than anyone I had interviewed. And he pointed out again and again how George was, if you did something the non-George way, George would spot it immediately. And he would tell him, shave off this millimeter. What are you thinking? Or this is, this joint is not up to par. And George put his blessing on every piece that went out as far as Adam was concerned. So.
But do you think, and this relates to another question that's been asked, do you think this worked both ways? Did George adjust anything of his thinking or his work based on what the craftsman brought to the table, so to speak?
I think he was very fortunate to have a number of woodworkers who were trained in Europe before they came. Maria, who was interviewed, was talking about, she says, "Oh, don't do anything wrong, it's no good," or something. And then Adam was voiced the same thing, and they were both trained in Europe before they came here. And Dad learned from them as well as them learning from him, the same way he did with the fellow in the internment camp from Japan. I mean, Dad learned from him, and the fellow learned from Dad. It's always been, a give and take kind of situation, and we're very grateful for that. We wouldn't survive without it. Even though we do a lot of things over and over again, every project is a different challenge, and you have to have different eyes and a different mind to figure it out. And that's what's fun about it. It's also a challenge, but it's fun. Never gets boring.
Well, how has the process changed or not changed, Mira, since your father's death? I mean, you touched on this a little bit, but I mean, how there's for sure continuity, but has there been evolution as well?
We have a little bit of evolution here and there. We're still using most of the old decrepit machines, and they have to be tweaked and played with to work properly, but we still use a lot of the old machinery, some of which was my father purchased from Germany, decades and decades ago. We did add a time saver to our repertoire in the 1990s when I was doing some jobs with a whole bunch of big tables and cabinets and things, and it really does save a lot of time. So we're grateful for that. We have been since my father died, I think, especially since my manager came, we've been trying to create a file of the standard Nakashima processes, and everybody in the shop is supposed to keep a notebook so that they know the procedures by themselves. They won't need guidance. And my two design assistants have both had experience in building. One of them was building mostly architecture, the other was building furniture. But I think that's really important, that you don't just design on a piece of paper or a CAD and expect somebody to create a beautiful thing. You have to know how to build things. You have to have a sense of the way the wood works and the way the wood pile looks. So
yeah, another thing we left out was Sakura, or I left out, is Sakura in Japan that is licensed and closely associated with Nakashima, and they had it's a pretty big wood shop. It's on Takamatsu, very impressive operation, and their sitting, is like prototypes that George would send over, carefully boxed, and you would see the woodworkers come in with calipers and things, and they would try to faithfully as possible reproduce George's ideal.
Great.
Yeah, but
great.
I think beyond just the forms that we hope will be preserved, I think it's the spirit of the work, because without that sensibility, it's not the same. We have several younger workmen now who their hands know what's beautiful, and they create something that's beautiful, and it's almost a subconscious kind of thing. And the other people may do the same thing and do it just as well, but it doesn't have the same spirit. And we hope that that spirit is what will keep us going in the future, because that's what makes Nakashima different from even the folks in Japan.
Now, continuing on this thread, Lori Wasserman, and I'm sure many others, Mira, would like you to talk about your own work, because you've become a designer in your own right, of course. And the question is, could you talk about that and how your work continues or differs from your father's?
Well, as I mentioned before, each project, almost each project is a different adventure. So we try to preserve the methodology of making things out of wood. We don't like stuff that's melded in plastic and stuck together with metal somehow or other. We try to be as honest as possible with basic woodworking, and that has its limitations. We may, eventually expand into something different, but using the same technology, there's a lot of stuff that is a different design challenge. The old table bases sometimes don't work on something that's a really peculiar shape. I haven't seen it yet because I was sick yet a couple of days ago, so I didn't see what it looked like when it was put together. But we had a funny shaped piece of burl wood that's going to a very special client, and I was thinking the ordinary base does not work on this. We got to do something different. So I sent them a draft of what I thought would work, and they said no, they didn't like it. They liked the old one, and then I did a second version, and they liked that one. So it's it's always exciting making something new and different. I mean, it's I did a whole show. Bob Abel was very kind to us and had a number of shows. And he said that in order to establish yourself as a real designer, instead of just doing Nakashima reproductions, you've got to develop your own designs and name them names and have photographs and all this stuff. So I did that, and we had a show, and one part of it was in Philadelphia and part of it was at the studio, and people would walk in and they say, oh, where's the new stuff? We were still using the same wood. The understructure was different, but a lot of people don't realize the trouble we go through to create that understructure. It has to support, and it has to be aesthetically pleasing as well as strong. So it's always a challenge.
Great. There are a couple questions about the Peace Foundation and also the sacred tables, and including the one that was consecrated in New Hope and then installed under your supervision, Mira, in the Hall of Peace. Is that in Oroville, just outside?
That is
Pondicherry?
in Oroville, India. Yes. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I
Yeah.
actually went there last year. It was pretty amazing.
Oh,
yeah,
you
so,
did?
so yeah, yeah. I try to go into Golconda, but of course I planned poorly, and it was not open for to visitors the day I was there. But can you talk a little bit more about the Peace Foundation and these other kinds of projects like Oroville and the Altars to Peace that have been part of your father's ongoing legacy as overseen by you?
Well, we haven't been very active in finding another place to place a peace elder, but in 1984, when Dad got this huge log, and it was because of, I think it was a combination maybe of his experience during the war and also his experience in India. He had this inspiration, he had this dream to create peace altars for each of the continents of the world, a place where people could gather, that it didn't matter what your nationality or your race or your economic standing or anything was, but people could gather in peace together, to pray together, to meditate together, to think together about how to have peace in the world. And he built the first one that went to New York, and then we built the second one that went to Moscow, and the third one went to Oroville, India. Each of them have slightly different purposes. They were all consecrated as altars, as they should have been. And we need to place 3 more of them in 3 other continents. As I say, I've been too busy to really focus on finding new places for the peace altars to go. But we hope that someday, when one of our members of the board says, we need to envision little points of light around the entire globe so that we will encircle the globe in some way or other, and in that way be that much closer to world peace. I don't know. I hope that happens during my lifetime. We need to get going on it. And we have done other programs here at the studio. They've all been canceled this year because of COVID, but we hope to, when COVID is under control, we hope to resume our programs here at the studio. We have been doing tours, and we canceled all the tours this year as well. And anyway, life goes on.
Yeah, and it is a really wonderful complex in New Hope. Wendy, with over like, how many buildings is it now? Like it's over a dozen buildings on these really lovely grounds. And Wendy Frosch wants to know what plans you have for restoring and maintaining this magnificent complex that your father created.
Oh, nice to hear from Wendy. Wendy has her father and mother collected a lot of Nakashimas down in the Washington area, and her parents are both gone now, so it's nice to hear from her. We have been writing there. We have one person on staff now who's writing grants. When my mother passed in 2004, she willed one of our buildings, the arts building, to the foundation itself. So the foundation became responsible for trying to maintain the buildings. We also are on the World Monument list. We're on the National Historic Register. And so we're eligible to get grants to preserve the buildings. We just had an engineer here who was analyzing the concrete down at the pool house, and did a complete report for one of the grants that we received. And we have this grant writer working on some more grants. She's working on a grant for the archives as we speak, so that we will get some money to preserve them properly for posterity. And it's an ongoing situation, but we do have 2 people working at least part-time on the archives and preservation right now. And every now and then we get a grant, so we can actually, we were very lucky that we had a grant for the arts building itself through the University of Pennsylvania and the Getty. And we did a lot of restoration work on the arts building itself. So yeah, we're still here, Wendy, and I hope to see you someday.
Well, I have to say there are a lot of very passionate Nakashima devotees out there, many of whom are sending well wishes to both of you. We can't, we don't have time for all of them. I will mention Miriam Belov just wrote to say that the Nakashima table that you made for President and Mrs. Obama for the White House is is in Obama's office now, and was used in a video of him and Vice President Biden a few weeks ago. Just FYI. But to just sort of finish off, going back to the film. Well, like Mira, you have a lot of fans there. Monica Neighbors wants to know if John, if you're going to do a documentary on Mira next. but maybe I should ask you, John. You clearly have a lot more material to work with. You said that the architecture was an area that you wanted to explore further. But are there other areas, or were there other surprises in the course of making this film that you'd like to share with us now?
No, I don't think so. I think I've revealed the majority of the surprises I found.
I think there were surprises all the way along. At least there were for me.
Yeah.
Especially when you unpacked all those old letters.
Yeah.
Right. Well, we were supposed to end at 12 o'clock Eastern Standard Time, and we're about 20 minutes over now. So I think maybe we'll just say that there are more goodies to be found in that half hour of extras, John, that you said will be in the documentary DVD, which will soon be available through nakashimadocumentary.com. For those who can't wait that long, you have now about 11 hours and 40 minutes to see the documentary without the extras through the Design Miami website. I think we should also really thank Bob Abel of Modern Gallery, who helped facilitate this and who's been, of course, a real, he's very present in the documentary as well, but he's a great expert on Nakashima and very big supporter of Nakashima as well as Design Miami. So thank you, Bob. Mira, do you have anything you want to, last thoughts you want to share, or John?
Go ahead, John.
I just think it's a great message for this time, George's story, where people like kids are learning through learning how to use the tools first without having a a big long-term goal, and the lesson of George, like waiting till he was in his mid-30s to decide what his purpose in life was, and to use all of that time. I mean, he wasn't just wandering around the world having a big party. He was really looking for a deeper meaning in life, and then he learned how to use the tools. And so I think the big story is just to encourage people to not be guided by their tools, but be guided by what their big mission in life is. Not everybody can do that, of course. George was very lucky. He was lucky to have a depression that would allow him to do that. And a $250 steamship ticket. But yeah, I thought the way he came to make objects through ideas fascinated me. You know, it was like the depth of his ideas that went into like making the simplest objects is just amazing, I think. It's not just a chair. There's a lot of life put into that chair.
That's a beautiful way to end this talk. And so, sorry, Mira, like any final thoughts from you?
Well, I'm just really glad that the film is finally finished in its final form. We have seen many versions of this documentary, as I said, with many interviews, which I thought were fabulous, and they unfortunately did not make the final cut. So I hope that John Terry will continue with making a series, or expand the material that he has, because there's still a lot of material that I think is important. Maybe at some other time you can assemble it all and make a series of some kind, because it's been an adventure for 20 years, and I've been a little impatient, but I'm really happy with the results, and I congratulate you, John, for finally getting it going in spite of the COVID cancellation of all your film festivals. We are really extremely grateful to Design Miami and to Cameron PR for allowing us this opportunity, and in a way, I think a much larger audience is able to see this worldwide. And I think Dad would have liked that. So thank you very much for helping make that happen.
Yeah, and I think we would all second the hope that there will be more to come, John. And really, congratulations on this very incredible feat. And we hope this film continues to have many lives for a long time, much as George's work has had. So thank you both again for doing this. Thank you, John, for the film. Thank you, Mira, for participating, and thanks to the audience members for joining us. We had some great questions, and I'm sorry we weren't able to get to all of them. But hopefully we will be able to tackle the rest during the Q&A for your part 2 of the George Nakashima documentary, John, one day.
Are we going to be able to see some of the questions? Could you send them to us?
Yes, I'm sure we can do that. Let we will. We
Thank you,
will.
Lauren, for,
We
for
will arrange. Yes.
thank you,
Yes.
Lauren, for taking care of all the technical problems.
And thank
Putting
you,
it-
Lauren Arrigo of Design Miami, who has been the silent hero tonight. So on that note, we'll bring the session to an end, and we'll hope that everyone has a chance to see the documentary if they haven't. Thank you again.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.